This isn't yours.
Vanessa Reed snatched the check off the counter and held it up like evidence of a crime. "This isn't yours," she said flatly, 4 words, no hesitation, then tore it clean in half and dropped the pieces in front of him without so much as blinking. The sound of ripping paper cut through the entire lobby. Nobody moved. The security guard was already stepping forward. Phones were already recording. Every eye in Northbridge Bank was fixed on the man in the worn jacket, who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't flinched, hadn't moved. He stood there with the kind of stillness that made several people in the lobby quietly uncomfortable, as if he knew something the rest of the room didn't. Then the front door opened. Regional Director Richard Whitmore stepped inside, scanned the lobby, and went completely still. "Mr. Cole," he said, "what did they do to you? Who was this man, and what had Vanessa Reed just made the worst mistake of her career?" If you're new here, this channel is where we tell stories like this one every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Nathan Cole dropped his son off at school the same way he had every morning for the past 3 years, engine idling at the curb window down, watching, until Oliver disappeared through the front doors before pulling away. It was a small thing, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice or think twice about. But Nathan noticed. He had made a habit of noticing the small things ever since the day everything large and important had been taken away from him without warning. Oliver was 10 now, old enough to roll his eyes at his father's habit of waiting, young enough to still glance back at the car before he went inside. Nathan always caught that glance. He never said anything about it. Neither did Oliver. That was the kind of understanding that existed between two people who had lost the same person, wordless and exact, built out of 3 years of mornings that neither of them had expected to face alone. The drive from the school to downtown Seattle took about 34 minutes on a good day. Nathan knew the route well, not because he made it often, but because he had made it before years ago with someone else in the passenger seat. There was a stretch of road just before the bridge where the water appeared briefly between 2 buildings, a narrow slice of gray-blue that lasted only a few seconds before the city closed back in. His wife had always turned to look at it every single time, as if she were seeing it for the first time. He still noticed that gap. He still looked even though there was no one beside him to look with. He had chosen Northbridge Bank on purpose, though it was the kind of detail he hadn't explained to anyone, and had no intention of explaining. 11 years ago, he and Claire had walked into the Northbridge branch on 5th Avenue with almost nothing, a shared checking account, a few $1,000s, and a long list of things they planned to build together. The account was long closed. Claire was gone. But the building was still there, and Nathan had decided that if he was going to do something real in her memory, something with weight, something that would last, then it ought to start somewhere she had once stood. The check in his inside jacket pocket was for $6 million. It represented the first payment from the partial sale of his stake in Asterion Capital, the company he had spent a decade building from a single risk assessment algorithm into something that now moved quietly through the architecture of 3 major financial networks. He had never appeared in a magazine. He had never given an interview. The people who knew the name Nathan Cole in a professional context were the kind of people who didn't need to read about someone in order to know exactly who they were dealing with. Everyone else had no reason to know he existed, and he had worked carefully to keep it that way, not out of any particular modesty, but out of love for a 10-year-old boy who deserved a father who could show up to soccer practice without being recognized. The plan for the $6 million was straightforward. For 2 years, he had been quietly building a charitable fund designed to support single-parent families, to cover the specific gaps that public assistance programs routinely missed, to provide the kind of targeted practical help that made a measurable difference in whether a family actually stayed on its feet. He had never attached his name to the fund. He intended to keep it that way. Today was simply where it began. He parked 2 blocks from the bank and walked. His jacket was one he had owned for several years, good quality once a little worn, now the kind of thing a man keeps because it fits well, and he has never found a compelling reason to replace it. His shoes were clean but not new. He looked, in other words, like a man who had somewhere reasonable to be and no particular interest in impressing anyone along the way. That had always been sufficient. Until today, it had never occurred to him that it might not be. Vanessa Reed had been the branch manager of Northbridge's Fifth Avenue location for 4 years, and in that time she had built something she was genuinely proud of. Low error rates, strong client retention, a team that ran efficiently and professionally even when she wasn't in the room to oversee it. She had earned every part of it through years of work that most people in her position would have found exhausting. What had happened 2 months ago had not erased that record, but it had changed the way she moved through her own building. The incident had been a fraudulent check, a convincing one, the kind that passed initial visual inspection without raising any immediate flags. One of her tellers had processed it following standard protocol. The funds had been released before the fraud was identified, and by the time the account had been frozen, the money was already gone. The financial loss was recoverable. Her standing with the regional office, she had been told plainly by Richard Whitmore in a conversation she would not soon forget, was a different matter. He had been professional about it. He had also been very clear. The kind of clarity that follows you into the building every morning and sits just behind your eyes when you are trying to focus on something else. What the incident had done to Vanessa in practical terms was make her faster. Not more thorough faster. She had told herself those were the same thing, but they weren't, and somewhere underneath the conviction she likely knew it. What it meant in practice was that she made judgments about people in the first few seconds of seeing them, before paperwork, before questions, before anything they might actually say had the chance to complicate what she had already decided. She called it sharpened instinct. She had always trusted her instincts. She told herself she was still doing exactly that. She was standing near the front of the branch when Nathan walked in that Tuesday afternoon. She noticed him before he reached the counter, the jacket, the shoes, the unhurried way he moved, that carried none of the quiet assurance she had learned to associate with clients who came in to deposit significant amounts of money. She watched him approach the teller window. She watched the teller glance down at what he had placed on the counter, then look up with an expression that indicated something unexpected had arrived. Vanessa was already moving toward the window before the teller had a chance to signal her. She looked at the check for a few seconds. $6 million. She looked at the man who had placed it there. The judgment formed the way it always did, now fast and solid, closing around certainty before she had reached for anything else. She did not pick up the phone to contact the issuing bank. She did not begin the standard verification sequence. She had already decided, and the decision had very little to do with the check itself. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying easily across the nearby counters. "I'm going to need you to explain where this came from." It was not a question in any meaningful sense. It was the opening line of a conclusion she had already written. Nathan looked at her without changing his expression and told her she was welcome to call the issuing institution directly. They would confirm everything she needed within a few minutes. Vanessa looked at him. She looked at the check again. "Men like you," she said, "don't walk in here with $6 million. The words landed in the lobby the way a certain kind of cruelty always does, fast and clean, carrying just enough surface ambiguity for the speaker to claim afterward that they hadn't meant it the way it sounded. Nathan heard it. The teller beside her heard it. The woman waiting in line 3 feet away heard it and looked down at her phone without saying anything. A man near the door stopped pretending to check his watch. 2 people near the back of the lobby turned to look without fully understanding what they were looking at yet. What Nathan felt in that moment was not embarrassment. He was well past the age of being embarrassed by other people's assumptions about him. What moved through him was something cleaner and more specific than that anger, the kind that surfaces when a person understands with perfect clarity that they are being treated as less than what they are in public, in front of witnesses who are watching and choosing not to intervene. He thought about saying his name. He thought about how quickly the room would change in the 30 seconds after he said it. He thought about Richard Whitmore, who was scheduled to arrive at the branch at 2 in the afternoon for a meeting that Vanessa Reed knew nothing about. And he thought about Oliver, who would be home from school in a few hours, with no idea that his father was standing in a marble-floored bank lobby holding on to something he hadn't yet decided how to use. He said nothing. Vanessa picked up the check, held it at arm's length for a moment long enough to make it feel like a statement to the room, and tore it cleanly in half. The sound was sharp and final in the relative quiet of the lobby. She dropped both pieces on the counter without looking at Nathan, turned to signal the security guard, and told a nearby employee to call the police. She did not look at Nathan again. Around the lobby, phones were coming out. People who had been pretending not to watch stopped pretending. An older woman seated near the far wall said something low to the person beside her. "I don't know if he has a right to that money or not, but nobody deserves to be treated like this." Nathan heard it. He couldn't have said why exactly, but those 2 quiet sentences were the only thing in that entire lobby that kept the anger from becoming something couldn't contain. He stood exactly where he had been standing, hands at his sides, in the same bank where he and Claire had once walked in together with almost nothing and a long list of plans. The anger was still there, present and precise. He was not trying to set it down. He was holding it the way you hold something that belongs to you that you are not ready to release and that you have not yet decided what to do with. The security guard had just reached him when the front door of the branch opened behind them both. Richard Whitmore was 61 years old and had spent the better part of 3 decades in financial services, long enough to have developed the particular instinct that told a person before they had consciously processed anything that something in a room was very wrong. He felt it the moment he stepped through the front door of the 5th Avenue branch. The lobby was too quiet. The kind of quiet that follows something rather than precedes it. And the people standing near the windows had the specific stillness of individuals who had already chosen to watch rather than speak. It took him approximately 4 seconds to locate Nathan Cole. Nathan was standing near the teller counter with a security guard at his left shoulder and the torn halves of something on the counter in front of him. Whitmore's eyes moved to the counter, then back to Nathan's face, then to Vanessa Reed, who was standing a few feet away with the expression of someone who had just done something they were entirely certain about. The entire picture assembled itself in Whitmore's mind with the kind of speed that arrives when you already have all the pieces and simply have to arrange them. He crossed the lobby in a straight line, not quickly enough to suggest panic, but without hesitation. The security guard noticed him first and stepped back. Vanessa turned. Whitmore stopped in front of Nathan and did something that no one in the lobby, including Vanessa, had seen a regional director of Northbridge Bank do before. He lowered his head. "Mr. Cole," he said, "I'm sorry this happened. I'm very sorry." He did not look at Vanessa when he said it. He did not look at the torn check. He looked at Nathan, and his voice carried enough of the lobby that the people near the windows heard every word of it. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, in the way that understanding moves through a crowd, not all at once, but in a wave, person to person, face to face, the lobby began to shift. The security guard took another step back. A teller behind the counter leaned toward a colleague and said something low. 3 or 4 people near the door lowered their phones without having fully decided to. Vanessa Reed stood very still, as if stillness might retroactively change the shape of what had just happened. Nathan looked at Whitmore for a long moment. Then he said, "We should probably find somewhere to talk." His voice was even. Whatever the anger had been, and it had been real, specific, present, it was contained, now held somewhere internal, where it wasn't driving anything. That Whitmore would later think was the thing that stayed with him most from that afternoon, not the humiliation felt that had been handed to Nathan in front of a lobby full of witnesses, but the quality of control with which Nathan had chosen not to use what he was holding. The phone footage had already been uploaded before Whitmore crossed the lobby. That was simply how it worked in the current moment events, and their documentation now occurred nearly simultaneously, which meant the gap between something happening and something being seen by a large number of strangers had collapsed to almost nothing. By the time Nathan and Whitmore had moved to a private office at the back of the branch, the clip was already accumulating views on 2 platforms, and the comments were beginning to fill in the name Nathan Cole, not because most people watching knew who he was, but because a few people did, and a few people in the comments section of a viral video was sufficient. Inside the office, Whitmore sat across from Nathan and said what needed to be said without dressing it up. He told Nathan that Vanessa Reed had no knowledge of their scheduled meeting, that her actions had been taken entirely without instruction from the regional office, and that what had occurred in the lobby that afternoon was a failure that he intended to take personally. He was direct and unflinching about it, in the way that people are when they understand that the person across the table has enough information to be significantly more direct in return. Nathan listened. He asked 2 questions, one about the internal review process, one about the timeline, and then said he needed some time before he could discuss the partnership going forward. Whitmore said he understood. What Whitmore did not say, though, Nathan read it clearly, in the particular way the older man looked at the surface of the desk for a moment, before answering, was that the board was already aware of the situation, and that the next 48 hours were going to require careful navigation on multiple fronts. What neither of them addressed directly, because it sat between them at a frequency that both recognized and neither wanted to name first, was the footage. Asterion Capital had no public-facing presence. Nathan Cole had no public profile. The name had appeared in SEC filings, in the kind of trade publications that circulated among institutional investors, in the private correspondence of people who operated at a level where discretion was simply assumed. That was the architecture Nathan had spent years building and maintaining, not out of paranoia, but because it was the only version of his life that allowed him to be a father first, and everything else second. If the footage found the right audience, and it was already finding audiences faster than he had anticipated, that architecture was going to develop cracks. He drove home in the late afternoon light with the kind of focus that comes from needing to think without arriving at anything. He knew the shape of what was in front of him. He did not yet know what he was going to do with it. Oliver was already home when Nathan pulled into the driveway. The boy was 11 weeks from turning 11 and was currently in the phase of development where he processed most things by appearing not to have noticed them at all, which Nathan had come to understand meant he had noticed everything. The backpack was on the kitchen floor. There was a glass on the counter. The television was off, which was unusual enough for a Tuesday afternoon, that Nathan noticed it before he had taken off his jacket. Oliver was at the kitchen table with his tablet, and he looked up when Nathan came in with the expression he used when he was trying to determine whether the information he was carrying was going to be relevant to the conversation he was about to have. Nathan recognized the expression. He had seen it in the mirror. He set his keys on the counter and asked about school, and Oliver answered in the way that he always answered questions about school, which was to provide the minimum quantity of information required to satisfy the question without inviting follow-up. Dinner was a quiet thing, the comfortable kind of quiet that had developed between them over 3 years, and that Nathan had come to value more than he could have anticipated. It was after dinner, while Nathan was in the next room, that Oliver found the video. He hadn't been looking for it. He had been watching something unrelated, and the algorithm had done what algorithms do. It had placed the clip in front of him, with the indifferent efficiency of a system that registers engagement patterns rather than the particular age or emotional readiness of the person watching. Oliver watched it. He watched the lobby, the counter, the woman with the check. He watched his father stand there without moving, without speaking, while the room filled in around him with phones and noise, and the particular quality of public discomfort that looks from a distance almost like entertainment. He came to the doorway of the room where Nathan was sitting. "Dad," he said. Nathan looked up. Oliver held the tablet so his father could see the screen, and Nathan looked at it for a moment, and then looked at his son. "Is that you?" Oliver asked, though they both already knew the answer. Nathan said yes. Oliver looked at the tablet again, then set it down on the arm of the chair beside him, and looked at his father with an expression that was neither angry nor sad, but something quieter and more difficult than either. "If you weren't rich," Oliver said, "would she have said sorry?" Nathan had spent the better part of the afternoon in the company of people who were paid to give careful, accurate answers to complicated questions. He had nothing. The honest answer was no, and the honest answer was one he was not willing to offer his 10-year-old son as the last word on the subject, not because it was wrong, but because he was not prepared to let it stand there unchallenged in the middle of Oliver's understanding of how the world worked. But the alternative answers, the ones that softened or reframed or redirected, were things Oliver would see through immediately, and Nathan had no interest in being the kind of father who taught his son to accept comfortable dishonesty as a substitute for the real thing. So he said nothing. And Oliver, who was his father's child, in most of the ways that mattered, did not press him. He picked up his tablet, said goodnight, and went to his room. Nathan sat in the chair for a long time after that. Later that night, after the apartment had gone quiet, Nathan took out his phone and sat with it for a while before calling. Whitmore picked up on the second ring, which suggested he had been expecting to hear from him. Nathan told him he needed more time. Whitmore said that was reasonable. There was a beat in the conversation that carried more information than either of them articulated. "The board is going to want a resolution," Whitmore said carefully. "The footage isn't going away." Nathan said he understood that. "And our partners," Whitmore began, and Nathan said, "I know." They both understood what the partnership represented. The project that Whitmore had come to the branch to discuss that afternoon involved capital deployment at a scale that Northbridge needed and that Nathan was in a position to provide. Neither of them had any interest in walking away from it for reasons that had nothing to do with the work. But what had happened in the lobby that afternoon had introduced a variable that was not on either of their original agendas, and neither of them was quite ready to pretend that it hadn't. Nathan ended the call and set the phone on the table. The apartment was quiet in the particular way that apartments are quiet when a child is asleep in the next room, a different kind of quiet than the empty kind, fuller and more present. He thought about Oliver's question, sitting with it, the way you sit with something you can't set down and haven't yet figured out how to carry. He thought about the fund, about the families it was designed to reach, about the fact that it had not yet formally come into existence, because the check that was supposed to initiate it had been torn in half and dropped on a counter by a woman who had looked at him and seen everything she expected to see. He thought about Claire and about the account they had opened on 5th Avenue 11 years ago, and about all the long lists of plans they had made that had come true, and the one plan they had never thought to make because it had never seemed like something they needed to plan for. He had not been back to that branch since she died. He had told himself the choice of bank was purely symbolic. Standing in the lobby that afternoon, he had understood clearly and uncomfortably that it was considerably more than that. He sat with all of it until the city outside the window had gone fully dark. Then he turned off the lamp and went to bed, knowing that by morning he was going to have to decide what kind of man he intended to be about this, and that the decision was not going to be the simple one. He woke up before Oliver did, which was not unusual, and made coffee in the quiet of the kitchen, while the city outside was still doing the slow work of becoming itself again. He had slept deeply, which surprised him. He had expected to lie awake cycling through the same territory he had covered in the chair the night before, but at some point the weight of it had simply become too much to hold upright, and he had gone under. When he woke, something had settled in him. Not a decision exactly, more like the ground under where a decision would eventually stand. The anger was still there, but it was no longer the loudest thing. The question he was facing was not, he understood now, the one he had initially thought it was. He had spent most of the previous night framing it as a question of what to do about Vanessa Reed, or what to do about Northbridge Bank, or what to do about the footage that was still accumulating views while he slept. But those were the surfaces of the thing. Underneath all of it was a different question, one that Oliver had placed in front of him with 8 words and then walked away from, without demanding an answer. What did Nathan actually believe about the power he was holding, and what did he think it was for? He had built Asterian Capital over a decade of careful, deliberate work. He had built the charitable fund with 2 years of equally careful planning. He had built the life in Bellevue, the school runs, the quiet evenings, the ordinary visible smallness of it, because he believed genuinely and without irony that it was the best thing he could give his son. He did not think those choices were contradictions, but Oliver's question had illuminated something he hadn't examined closely enough. There was a difference between choosing to live without the weight of a public identity and choosing to stay invisible when invisibility had a cost that someone else was paying. The $6 million check had been for families who were in almost every measurable way more exposed than he was. Single parents navigating systems that were not designed with them in mind, children absorbing the specific texture of instability that comes from watching a parent try to hold everything together with insufficient resources. Nathan had designed the fund carefully, precisely because he knew what it felt like to be the person at the table who everyone assumes cannot possibly have what they actually have. He had simply never been in a position before where that assumption had consequences he couldn't quietly sidestep. He heard Oliver's door open down the hall. Oliver came into the kitchen, still in the t-shirt he'd slept in, poured himself a glass of water, and sat down at the table across from his father with the straightforward economy of movement that characterized most of his mornings. He did not bring up the video. He did not bring up the question he had asked the night before. He drank his water and looked out the window at the neighbor's yard, where the same bird that had been investigating the same patch of grass for the past 2 weeks was investigating it again. It was Oliver who spoke first. "Are you going to do something about it?" he asked, without specifying what it was, because he did not need to. Nathan looked at his son across the table at the particular quality of attention Oliver brought to things he considered important, which was the same quality of attention he had brought to everything since he was very small, and which was in certain lights exactly like watching someone he had loved very much. "I'm thinking about it," Nathan said. Oliver looked at him steadily. "I know," Oliver said. "But are you going to do something?" Nathan set down his coffee. "Yes," he said. "I think I am." Oliver nodded as if this confirmed something he had already worked out on his own and went to get ready for school. He called Whitmore at 9 o'clock and told him he was ready to meet. He suggested they do it at the house in Bellevue, not because it was convenient, but because he wanted the conversation to happen somewhere that belonged to him on ground he had chosen, rather than in an office that carried the institutional weight of everything that still needed to be resolved between them. Whitmore arrived at 11 without a team and without a lawyer, which Nathan had asked for, and which Whitmore had agreed to without negotiating. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and Nathan laid out what he wanted in plain language that required no interpretation. He was not withdrawing from the partnership. That was the first thing he said, and he said it directly, so that the rest of the conversation could happen without that particular uncertainty hovering over it. But he had 3 conditions, and he was going to need all 3 of them in writing before anything else moved forward. Whitmore listened without interrupting, which Nathan noted and appreciated. The first condition was a full internal review, not a summary, not a statement of regret, but an actual documented investigation with findings that would be shared with the Regional Compliance Board. Nathan did not specify what the outcome should be. He was explicit about that. He was not asking for Vanessa Reed to lose her position. He was asking for a process that was thorough enough that its conclusions, whatever they were, would be credible. What had happened in that lobby was not an isolated event generated by a single person's bad judgment on a single afternoon. It was the product of a culture that had allowed a certain kind of shortcut to exist, and the investigation needed to be honest about that. Or it was not worth the paper it was written on. The second condition was structural. Northbridge would implement a revised training protocol for branch-level staff, developed with input from an external equity consulting firm rather than an internal committee, and the protocol would be reviewed annually for a minimum of 5 years. Whitmore said this was manageable. Nathan said he wanted it contractually bound to the partnership agreement, not appended as a letter of intent. Whitmore said he understood the distinction and would make it happen. The third condition was the fund. Northbridge would co-sponsor the charitable initiative Nathan had originally come to the branch to set in motion, not as a public relations gesture with Nathan's name attached to a press release, but as a long-term institutional commitment with legally binding disbursement requirements. He also made clear that a replacement check would be issued through proper channels within the week, and that the fund's first distribution would proceed on the original schedule, regardless of how long the broader negotiations took. The money would flow to families, regardless of what the quarterly news cycle looked like, regardless of whether the partnership was generating positive coverage that season, regardless of whether anyone outside the relevant parties ever knew that Northbridge was involved. The fund did not exist to make the bank look good. It existed to make a measurable difference in a specific set of people's lives, and if the bank wanted to be part of that, it would be on those terms exactly. Whitmore sat with the third condition for a moment longer than he had sat with the first 2. Then, he said he would need to take it to the board. Nathan said that was fine, and that he would need an answer within a week, and that if the answer was no, they could revisit the terms of the broader partnership at that point. He said it without heat. Whitmore looked at him across the kitchen table and said with something that was not quite admiration, but was adjacent to it, "You've thought about this for a while." Nathan said, "I thought about it this morning." Whitmore accepted this and finished his coffee. The board took 5 days, not 7. The deliberation was not smooth. Nathan had expected that. 2 members pushed back on the third condition in the specific way that people push back on things that cost more than they anticipated and offer less visible return than they prefer. One of them used the phrase reputational leverage in a way that Nathan found clarifying. The negotiation went 3 rounds before the language of the commitment was precise enough that Nathan was willing to sign his name to it. It was not a comfortable process, and there were 2 points during it where he genuinely was not certain it was going to hold together. That was fine. Things that held together too easily were rarely holding the right things. Vanessa Reed's internal review concluded independently of all of it run by the compliance board without input from Nathan or from Whitmore's office. He did not hear the specific findings. What he did hear through Whitmore was that the review had been thorough, that it had addressed questions beyond the immediate incident, and that Vanessa had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of a licensing review. Nathan received this information and did not feel the particular satisfaction that the narrative structure of the situation seemed to be offering him. What he felt was something closer to sorrow, not for Vanessa Reed exactly, but for the specific mechanism by which ordinary people in positions of authority can convince themselves that fear and judgment are the same thing and can cause real harm to real people while believing they are doing their jobs correctly. He had never found cruelty in others difficult to understand. That was not the same as excusing it. The fund's inaugural distribution event was held on a Saturday morning in March in a community center in South Seattle that Nathan had selected because it was 2 blocks from an elementary school and had a parking lot large enough to accommodate families with children. He had considered not attending. He had turned the question over for about a week, weighing the version of himself that had spent years making a practice of absence against the version of himself that had sat at a kitchen table with his son and said yes, he attended. Oliver came with him dressed in the same way Oliver always dressed for things his father considered significant, which was to say he wore clean clothes and a look of composed curiosity that made him appear simultaneously younger and older than he was. They arrived early before most of the families. Nathan stood near the back of the room as people filled in watching faces in the way he had always watched things quietly without announcing himself. A woman near the front was explaining something to her daughter in a low voice, pointing at a display that described the fund's criteria and application process. An older man in the corner was reading the materials with the focused attention of someone who had not expected to find himself in a room like this and was not quite sure what to do with the fact that he had. A boy about Oliver's age was sitting near a window, drawing something in the margin of a brochure. Nathan stood there and felt in a way that had no clean language around it that this was the version of the afternoon he had come to the bank for. Not the check, not the lobby, not any of the things that had happened afterward. This room, these people, the specific practical reality of a thing that had existed only in planning documents for 2 years and was now in the most literal sense present. Oliver found him near the end of the event after the formal remarks had been made, and the room had shifted into the looser movement of people finding each other and talking. He stood beside his father and looked around the room for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "These are the people the money is for." Nathan said yes. Oliver looked at the boy near the window, who had filled most of the brochure margin with what appeared to be a very detailed drawing of a spaceship. "Okay," Oliver said. He said it in the tone he used when he had finished processing something and had arrived at a conclusion he found acceptable. Nathan put a hand briefly on his son's shoulder. Oliver did not shrug it off, which at 10 years old constituted a meaningful gesture of affirmation. Driving home that afternoon, Oliver looked out the passenger window at the city moving past them, and after a while he said, "Dad, I asked you something the other night, about whether she would have said sorry." Nathan kept his eyes on the road. "I remember," he said. Oliver turned to look at him. "I think I already knew the answer," Oliver said. "I just wanted to see what you'd do." Nathan let that sit for a moment. "And," he said. Oliver looked back out the window. "You did something," he said simply. That's better than just knowing the right answer. Nathan thought about that for the rest of the drive. The water appeared between the buildings and was gone again before he could hold on to it the way it always was, a few seconds of open space in the middle of everything else, and then the city closing back in. He did not look away from it. He looked at it the way he had been trying to learn for 3 years, to look at the things that were there, and then not there, which was to say directly, and without pretending that looking was the same as holding on, but also without pretending that it wasn't worth doing. He drove home. Oliver fell asleep in the passenger seat somewhere on the highway, in the particular way that children fall asleep in cars suddenly and completely, as if the world had simply agreed to hold still for a while. Nathan turned the radio down and drove the rest of the way in quiet, and found that the quiet was the good kind. The woman in that lobby made a judgment in 3 seconds, and it cost her everything she had spent years building. But the man she misjudged chose not to use his power the way the world expected him to. He used it to build something instead. Most of us will never have $6 million to put in a check. But all of us will face the same choice Nathan faced, whether to respond to unfairness with force or with something harder and more lasting. That choice doesn't require wealth. It only requires deciding what kind of person you want to be when it actually costs you something. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. We tell stories like this one every week. Stories about ordinary moments that reveal something true about who we are and who we're capable of becoming. We'll see you in the next one.